Was on Twitter one day and I saw hashtag Klondike Papers everywhere. And so I looked it up, and the first thing I came to were some podcasts by the Dean Blundell and then Blackballed. And I watched those. They're all several hours long. And then found a Reddit post. And it's a very intriguing story. It's like so many ins and outs and everything. And I was absolutely fascinated by it. But it was so complex and so many moving pieces. So I sat down and put it all together in what would make the most sense to me. And then posted, if you're curious about this, then check it out on my blog, which normally gets about 100 hits on a post. And this got about 40,000 hits, like in a day. So that was a bit overwhelming. So I regret that I was a little sloppy about saying where I was getting every piece of information, and to go back now and fill it in would be onerous. But I'm used to nobody actually seeing it. So, and then you came across it and said, actually, let's fix a couple mistakes in there. And so I went back and corrected it. And it seems like the two big things. So I got most of my information from what David Wallace said on those two podcasts. And I didn't realize until this morning that you also had been on their pod. I hadn't seen that. I just saw the Davis Wallace ones. I hadn't watched, so I haven't seen you on those.
Yeah.
And so it looks like the two biggest points of discrepancy are around the convoy and Russia. Can you speak to those two things? That I think those seem to be the biggest ones that you're like, this is not quite accurate.
Yeah, I mean, what happened on the podcast is that people were sort of speaking quite fast and speaking very freely, and David in particular started off talking about the stuff that's specifically in the Klondike Papers and the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church, and then he went on to talk about some of his own political views and his own political theories, and he didn't really make it clear that he'd moved on from, what was in the papers and there was documentary evidence for, to what was just his opinion of what was actually going on behind the scenes. And then also Nathan Jacobson was talking about the Brethren, and then Nathan Jacobson was talking about evangelical churches as a whole and their political influence. And then he went on to talk about the convoy, and it left the impression with a lot of people that Nathan was talking about the Brethren, where in fact he was talking about just sort of evangelical or right-wing Christian groups as a whole and their influence in the convoy. David definitely did say some things that were not factual. David is a complex person. He's not this kind of cold James Bond icy character. He gets very emotionally involved in what he's doing and what he's saying. And so you have to sort of understand that he is, he feels very strongly about these things. And when he's putting out this stuff, he's in the zone, and, he's not reporting like a reporter would report, or even like a impartial bystander. He's lived in all this stuff, so you have to kind of take that into account. And then other commentators like Dean Blundell kind of summarize some of this stuff without any of the usual sort of caveats that, well, this is alleged or anything, and then that got picked up, and every time it gets passed on, the thing gets polarized. So something that's just suggested as a possibility 3 stages down the kind of chain of communication becomes an established fact. So yeah, there was a certain amount of misinformation flying around, and politically inclined people were using it to reinforce their particular worldview, as reasonably you'd expect them to. I wasn't too concerned, because the whole Klondike Papers are going to be published at some point, and then everyone can see what is in them, what isn't in them. I kind of liken it to speculating about who's going to win the World Cup. I mean, people will say very definitely and firmly this or that team is going to win, and it's harmless for them to make those assertions because at some point you have the final and then you know who's won. So at some point the speculation will be done because the whole thing's going to be published. But my concern was that I didn't want my personal credibility to be damaged by the misinformation. And I didn't want serious journalists who would have a very legitimate interest in the stories to be put off or not to look into the stories because they were tainted with this stamp of conspiracy theory. I mean, to be clear, the Klondike Papers in themselves are not a conspiracy theory. They're simply David Wallace's records of 5 years, all his emails, all his direct messages, all his Twitter. But conspiracy theories have started to grow around them, and it's a good idea to, point out that that's what it is.
What percentage would you say of the Klondike Papers are dealing specifically with the Brethren Church, like with your church and with your situation? Is that the bulk of it, or is that just a little?
No, it's probably less than 10%.
Oh.
But that's still a lot of paper. I mean, 10% of 6,000 is 600 pages, maybe a little more than that, but that order, yeah. As specifically for the convoy and Russia, there is a huge amount of stuff about Russia in the Klondike Papers, all sorts of connections and lots of big Russian names and big Ukrainian names. And what it looks like is, and it's very complicated to analyze, there seem to be lots of schemes whereby Russian money is being tried to be invested into Canada, into all sorts of schemes, sort of art and residential developments, and there's nothing that I, as a sort of complete amateur, can pick on and say this is definitely illegal. There is definitely reference to bypassing sanctions, and there's also things that are not illegal, but they smell really bad. For example, there's a sort of a collaboration of conservative or right-wing political operatives who are trying to buy a bank in the Turks and Caicos. Now, the Turks and Caicos are tiny islands, a bit like the Cayman Islands, where all the kind of tax evaders hang out and keep their money. So if someone opens a bank account in the Turks and Caicos, you can guess, well, they're trying to put money offshore and evade tax. But when they're actually trying to buy the bank, not open an account, but buy a bank in the Turks and Caicos, you kind of think, something is not right here.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of thing that the Klondike Papers is full of. There's not hard criminal proof of criminal stuff, but there's kind of stuff that's really, really hard to find a decent explanation for. And that's made all the worse by the fact that the people involved in it are often members of, active political activists and members of political parties and city councillors and so on. And it all smells really bad.
Mm-hmm.
But it would need, international finance money laundering is incredibly complicated. And there's a whole lot of red flags in the Klondike Papers, but it would need someone, sort of an international accountant, forensic accountant, to really put their finger on it. So that's Russia. Certainly Russian money coming into Ontario is very prominently represented. Whether that money is going into ultimately supporting sort of PACs or political activity isn't clearly established. It looks more like, I'm the last person to know. It looks more like people who have been maybe sanctioned by Russia trying to get their money out of Russia sanctioned by Canada, trying to get the money out of Russia and into Canada. What it's used for after that isn't so obvious, but someone could probably connect the dots.
Right.
As for the convoy, there's no reference to the convoy in the Klondike Papers. There is, however, as I tweeted, a very interesting, very strong piece of circumstantial evidence of a very high up member of the conservative UCP party directing violent anti-vax protesters to the houses of liberal politicians, their private residences, which is, you might say, a similar tactic, but on a local scale, on a provincial scale, rather than on a national scale. So there's a hint of that kind of thing, but in the Klondike Papers themselves, there's no reference to the convoy.
Now, to the people involved, I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit more about. So you named the papers after Brad Mitchell's company.
Yes.
Was he a particularly prominent force in all the things going on, or?
Yeah, he was the guy who was commissioning the private investigators to hunt me down. He commissioned Stuart Morse, who was pro-West Investigations, who was out of Calgary. And then when Stuart Morse couldn't find me, he was the one who commissioned David Wallace. And he then, further to that, he sent David Wallace, once he had engaged David Wallace, he sends him my wife's private phone log. And she doesn't even have an itemized phone bill. So it isn't like he'd found it by going through a garbage can. It must have come directly from the phone company. And then he was also engaged with sending David Wallace some phone logs of other people or phone information for other people, which, according to David was so impressed that he could access my wife's phone log so easily. David had some other jobs where he needed phone information, so he just goes to Brad and asks him as a favor if he could look this up for him. So, and then Brad is also, there's another story on there where Brad, he's very deeply involved in these government contracts, which was supplying PPE. In the early days of the pandemic, when there was a massive PPE shortage, the Brethren businesses all around the world somehow magically got huge government contracts to supply face masks and gloves and things. In the UK, it merited a kind of a double spread in the Times, which is, probably the world's most prestigious newspaper, saying that I think 57 Brethren-owned businesses, scooped £2.3 billion of PPE contracts from the government, non-competitively. They were just awarded the contracts without competition. And of course, the way the Brethren operate is highly centralized, single global command center. So I knew that they would be doing it in every country in the world if they were doing it in one. And meanwhile, Press Progress was investigating this. And turns out Brad Mitchell was at the center of the effort in Canada to access all this sort of bonanza of PPE contracts. And so there's a story in there where he ordered $250,000 worth of gloves from a company in Texas. These like the nitrile exam gloves. He never got the goods, but he'd already paid the money. So then he's trying to hire what do they call it? A bounty hunter, some kind of muscular, well-armed thug to go and put the thumb screws on his debtor. So he calls up David Wallace because he thinks, well, David's well connected with the underworld. And then there's Brad trying to hire a character called Chuck Zito. You can look him up on Wikipedia, who's this kind of horrific, he's a famous ex-Hells Angels boss, with all kind of criminal record and a whole load of metal in his face, kind of satanic character, which is very kind of unchristian when you consider that Brad Mitchell, as well as being Klondike Lubricants, is also a manager for Ox Tools, which is a business belonging to Dean Hales, who is the son of Bruce Hales, who's the leader of the Exclusive Brethren. So he's right up there in the top of the Brethren, and for him to be hiring, Hell's Angels bosses to terrorize people, it is ugly and unchristian, but it also speaks strongly to what might have happened to me if they had got hold of me. So that's an interesting story. But again, it takes a bit of digging to find it in the Klondike Papers, because there's these references to Chuck and there's these references to Vinny, and you have to do a lot of digging around to find out that Vinny is Vinny Paz, who's a famous boxer, ex-championship boxer, who's an old friend of David Wallace's. And then Vinny Paz was trying to find Chuck. And then you have to get the context to find that Chuck was actually this Chuck Zito, who's a bounty hunter, and then it all hangs together. So some of these sort of commentators who say, oh, well, I just got the Klondike Papers and I did a keyword search and this and that isn't in it. They're being a little hasty because it's not all laid out like a picnic. It's kind of, I'd say, it's sort of kind of like a graveyard. You've got the grave markers that tells you where things are buried, but unless you do the digging, you don't actually know what's under the surface. So, yeah, don't remember what the question was, but that's the answer anyway.
Yeah, just who he was and how he figures so prominently.
Yes. So, I mean, he's a particularly central and ugly manifestation of the Plymouth Brethren Christian Church. He's connected directly to the head office, to the leader, Bruce D. Hales, multiple links. He is, the fact he was put in charge of the operation says that he's the most prominent or the most influential of the Plymouth Brethren congregation in Canada. And Klondike just has a nice ring to it. I didn't actually name it that. It was named by a friend of mine who was also ex-Brethren, who had been exceptionally cruelly treated, who is still fighting legal battles with them. And this was his suggestion, but he doesn't, for legal reasons, he doesn't want to be named. So I'm kind of taking the credit for the name, but it wasn't actually my idea. Yeah.
Now, what about Gerald Shapur? So at one point, I think it was David, somebody said he was the most dangerous man in Canada. Does he live in Canada and he's part of the Brethren? And
no, that was a misconception. I think that was partly because Nathan Jacobson was talking about the sort of right-wing Christian groups in general, and which Gerald Shapur is a part of, but he's not a part of the Brethren. There are no lawyers, or very, very few lawyers in the Brethren, because they haven't been allowed to attend university since about 1965. So the only Brethren that are actually qualified lawyers are now in their 80s. So, but Gerald Shapur is a kind of prominent member of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, sort of prominent enough to give published sermons. He has made his living defending religious freedom. Mostly it was cases like where a church or a pastor had, for example, refused to marry a same-sex couple, and then, has the pastor been discriminatory or so on, and he's always on the side of kind of defending the right of religions to discriminate in things like same-sex couples and other sort of religious taboos, whether they are or are not allowed to be discriminatory in a range of situations, which makes him well suited to the Brethren. But they've been using him since at least 2008. They used him to hunt down a guy called Tim Twyman, who published the first ever website that was critical of the Brethren, which was a bit of a shock to them. And there's a whole load of old legal papers that show how they hunted this guy down. There was Gerald Shipper and some brethren from the US. Because Gerald Shipper is a dual citizen. He kind of dodges between USA and Canada. And they hired private investigators. Gerald Shipper apparently told the private investigator, who was a woman, that if necessary, she should sleep with this guy to get the secrets out of him, which again is a little un-Christian. Yeah, very ugly. And eventually they managed to shut his website down, and they got some legal injunction on the guy. And he has never ever says anything about the Brethren. I mean, he's still on Facebook and he still posts funny cartoons, but never ever says anything about the Brethren. They basically legally cut his tongue out. Yeah, and he's been mixed up in all sorts of dirty business, shady business, while at the same time having this very pious exterior and preaching in their Adventist churches. Nothing against the Adventists; they're actually quite a decent bunch in general. Certainly compared to the Brethren, they're very moderate in their views. But I think the reason David says he's the most dangerous man in Canada, and that's kind of echoed by Nathan Jacobson, is that he, according to Nathan Jacobson, who would know, he basically channels the funds from the various right-wing Christian denominations and donors into, for example, not just the Conservative Party as a whole, but specifically to party leadership candidates who endorse this kind of religious freedom, right to discriminate point of view, which, you know, in the present round of things is Pierre Poilievre, who's very spoken out quite strongly about the right of religious groups to, he calls it freedom of religion, but it's kind of a balance between human rights and religious rights, which trumps which. I mean, the human rights aspect would say that you're not allowed to discriminate against a same-sex couple if they wish to get married in your church. If you will marry opposite-sex couples, then it's discriminatory to refuse to marry a same-sex couple. Religious rights says, well, you know, if it's their religious belief that homosexuality is a sin, then you're infringing on their religious rights if they can't refuse to marry them. And the general tendency globally is that left-wing politics tends to emphasize the human rights, right-wing politics tends to emphasize religious rights, and that's why all these, you know, very conservative churches tend to promote right-wing politicians, because they're afraid that they're going to be forced to do things that would be against their religious beliefs. Now, there's no proof in the Klondike Papers as such, in the printed records, that Shipper is doing this. The thing that is very interesting to me, I mean, the only evidence really that I've got that this is happening is what Nathan Jacobson said. The reason I think it's significant is that Nathan Jacobson he owns a lot of property in Canada. He owns businesses in Canada. He's a very prominent figure and everyone knows his address. If he was to say something like that about Gerald Shipper and it wasn't true, Gerald Shipper, who's of course is a top lawyer, would sue the guy for every last penny. David can say what he likes. David hasn't got any money. If someone sues David, David goes bankrupt. Doesn't make any difference to the guy. For someone as prominent as Nathan Jacobson to say this without any caveats and any it's been alleged, that's pretty significant. I mean, why would he do that? And why wouldn't Gerald Shipper immediately be suing him if it's not true? So the answer is there's nothing in the Klondike Papers that says that Shipper is the most dangerous man in Canada. There's definitely a lot in the Klondike Papers that says he's a very unscrupulous and dishonest person. But what Nathan Jacobson reported, I think, should be taken seriously. People should be asking, why would Nathan, who's a very prominent conservative, be saying this if it wasn't true?
Yeah, the other question I have around the money, and when you're talking about the money and the Conservative Party, and how the church will support them, is that, do you think the Brethren is any different from any other religious group that supports one party? And like you said, that they benefit from right-wing politics because they're more protected generally. Is that because if we're looking at, like, is the Brethren any worse than any, like the Catholic Church or anything else for supporting political figures? Because that's something that sort of is seen as a bad thing or as an unsavory thing, that they're giving all this money to the Conservative Party. But is it necessarily a problem, or is it just, this is the party I support? And so
yeah, that's a very good question. There's 2 points there. The first is that the Brethren don't vote. They quote the scripture where Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world," and they don't actually believe in democracy. They believe democracy is, somehow defective or flawed. They think monarchy is the way things should be. And so for people that don't vote because they're an unworldly people and they are, subjects of Christ the King and his kingdom is not of this world, it's very odd that they will not vote, and yet they will do all sorts of dirty and unscrupulous things to try and promote political parties. So I mean, that's just it's not that that's illegal, it's just hypocrisy. The other thing that differs, makes them differ from the other churches who are supporting the Conservatives, is that I would say almost all the other churches are supporting the Conservatives for kind of religious, ideological reasons: the abortion, the same-sex marriage, the, what they call the woke thing, and so on. And those churches sincerely have those beliefs, and it's fair enough for them to, speak out and state their views. But the Brethren, their connections with politicians, they've got 2 primary reasons to try and influence politicians. One is that their charitable status is on the line. They actually lost their charitable status in the UK for nearly 2 years, or it was suspended because to be a charity, you have to be of public benefit. And because the Brethren is a closed society, and because they split up families and cause all sorts of distress, the government was arguing, well, look, you're not a public benefit. You're just like a private club. What good are you doing for the world? Why should you get charitable tax breaks? Why shouldn't you pay rates on your meeting halls? And it really shocked the Brethren. I mean, it would have been financially devastating for them if they were taxed as if they were a club. And so that's probably one of the, well, I don't know which would be more important, but one very, very important reason the Brethren try to get in with politicians, or try to get their friendly politicians into power, is that they have this feeling that sooner or later, in some country or other, they're going to no longer be a charity. And then the other reason, of course, is that that's how they get these huge government contracts. I mean, in the UK's got a population of 65 million. There's like 16,000 Brethren in the UK, and they scoop about 30% of the total government COVID contracts. 57 different Brethren businesses somehow mysteriously scoop £2.3 billion. I mean, the only way you can do that is by, having very, very strong links and connections with the politicians. It's ultimately the politicians who, and I mean, in the UK, it was very transparently so, because they set up what they called a VIP lane for people who could, supply COVID materials very urgently. And that was run through the members of parliament. So a Brethren company would approach his MP and say, yes, I can, offer you this. The MP would then forward the message on to the VIP lane in the Department of Health or whatever it was. and then the contract would be awarded. And that's all being dug up and dug over in the UK at the moment. But I mean, this is just sort of classical government corruption, and there's lots of examples of it in the Klondike Papers, which don't relate to the Brethren at all, which is basically that a politician who has the power to award a contract will give it to one of his buddies. His buddy will inflate the profit margins to something ridiculous, and by circuitous means, the money gets back to the member of parliament or councillor who awarded the contract in the first place. So this is really, the Brethren are not at all into, they don't care at all about abortion. They don't even care about same-sex marriage anymore. They've dropped that one. What they're interested in is retaining their charitable status for financial reasons and getting lots of money for financial reasons. So it's not an honest political, ideological viewpoint. It's all about money.
Yes. So the way it sounds is that they operate kind of like Walmart. That's what I'm kind of getting, the way you're discussing it, that they've sort of got some ins and some connections, and it's very profitable for them. And if they were Walmart, it's kind of underhanded, but we sort of recognize that's what big business does, except this is a church, which makes it very different, that they're not supposed to be operating like a Walmart.
And Walmart doesn't get charitable status. Walmart has to pay taxes. So they've got this kind of double advantage, which sort of makes their operations hugely profitable, is that a lot of their operations can be run on a tax-free basis by being under some kind of a charitable umbrella. And because they operate globally and all their charities are internationally linked, it's almost impossible to unravel it, because the money is actually sliding all around the globe quietly and disappearing into countries where it's very hard to analyze who the final beneficiary is. I mean, there's a journalist called Damien Hasty who did most of the original research that was finally published in the Times, and he's done this very, very thorough analysis of all the UK COVID contracts the Brethren got. And now he's moved on to try and look globally at what's going on in all the other countries. And he came up with this astonishing figure that of the COVID contracts the Brethren have got so far globally, if you divide the total value of those contracts by the total number of Brethren, which...
Oops, you froze for a second. Let's see.
Number. I mean, that's...
You froze for a bit there, if we want to repeat the last sentence there. Yeah.
Okay, so Damien Hasty has done this research into all the COVID contracts the Brethren have got globally. And if you take the total value of those contracts and you divide it by the total number of Brethren, sort of men, women, and children, every single one of them, it comes to about £60,000 per head, which is what, about 100,000 Canadian dollars per head for every single member of the Brethren in the world. I mean, that's an incredibly, I mean, that's not the profit, that's the value of the contract. So you can say, well, what's their profit margin going to be? Well, probably something between 10% and 50%. It's a huge, huge amount of money. And it's a huge amount of money for such a tiny church. Per capita, it's a huge amount of money. It's far more than they can possibly use. You know, I mean, the people inside the Brethren are told that all this is just to fund the Brethren school. And they really believe that. They think that, they're all, as well as all this sort of enormous floods of money coming in from these contracts, individual Brethren are still, every week, every month, they're donating large sums of their own personal earnings directly to the church. So the money is sort of pouring in from outside the church, and within the church, the money is pouring into their centrally operated charities. And, while no one has proved it yet, the kind of, what's generally happening in these situations is that the actual leadership of the church are getting immensely rich. And sure enough, Bruce Hales has built himself an enormous new mansion in Sydney. His son has just built an even larger mansion next door. And at the moment, and this is in a very, very exclusive subdivision of Sydney, Australia, and at the moment they're just demolishing 2 large old houses behind these 2 houses to make way for a 3rd large mansion. So it's sort of like a family compound, and it's, you know, it's got 24-hour security, and they've got their private jet and, you know, all the trappings like the big American televangelists. But the brethren, actual brethren, grassroots brethren, don't connect this in their heads to all the money that they're putting in the collection basket every day and all these big business operations. It's all for the schools. It's for the benefit of the young people, and they believe it.
So the people themselves aren't getting, you know, wealthy. Although, are they taken care of? Is it sort of socialist in that if you are in the Brethren and you're lost your job or something, will the rest of people come and help you out financially? Is it that sort of?
Yes, it is. Yes, I mean, you get well looked after in there financially. No one's kind of left to go to the dogs. Your average brethren member is much more wealthy than he was 10 years ago. But there's also a much larger gap now between the wealthiest brethren and the poorest brethren. Mm-hmm. So, and what's happened is they kind of came in with this new rule that if you're in the brethren, you must work for a brethren company. So all brethren are either business owners and employ other brethren, or they're employed by brethren. And so now you've got a very much a kind of a divide. There's the very, very wealthy business owners who, you know, have got lots of money and big Range Rovers and big houses and live a very, very extravagant lifestyle. And then there's their employees who, yes, they get a decent wage, but boy, do they ever have to work long hours for it. And so that, you know, there's quite a lot of, it's becoming a 2-stream society. There's 2 classes. There's the employers and the employed, and there's a bigger and bigger sort of ever increasing wealth gap between the 2.
Right. And so even though people are working and they can, you know, choose where they want to work, it has to be within this. So they're basically like owned. It sounds like they're like,
oh, yes. I mean, you can't move to a different city or a different place without permission actually from Bruce Hales personally. And you can't even move a house within a city without permission from your local leading brother. And so you're very much owned, very much circumscribed. And more or less, I mean, when young brethren graduate from school, they're told where to work. You know, if they're lucky, they might get 1 or 2 job options, but it's not really a freedom of choice. I mean, you can't get married in the Brethren without personal permission from Bruce Hales. He has to approve the match. Everything is very, very tightly controlled. I mean, I don't know if you watched that. There's a Netflix documentary called Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey about the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints Church, FLDS, which is a polygamist cult down in Arizona and Texas. And apart from the polygamy thing, I kind of watched the whole thing through, absolutely fascinated, because apart from the polygamy thing, everything else is just carbon copy. You know, right down to quite small regulations, like you can't wear red, and you need permission to leave town, and you need permission from the big chief to get married. You can't choose who you get married to. He has to approve it. I mean, there's so much that's identical. If anyone's interested in trying to understand what life in the Brethren is like, they need to watch that. You know, just, okay, they're not polygamous. The Brethren did kind of toy with the idea in the 60s, but then they swung back the other way and went very prudish. But yeah, it's the control mechanism and the idolization of a single sort of leading man are just exactly the same.
So would you say how would it compare to things like other closed systems like the Mennonite or the Amish, kind of those where they're going to their own schools and they sort of stay within their own group? Is it similar, or what would be the difference between those two kinds of things?
Well, the Amish and the Mennonites practice a kind of a physical separation from the world. They live in their own communities, while the Brethren practice separation, but they actually live in normal houses or normal streets next door to normal people. I don't know much. I mean, there would be some commonalities, but the Amish don't have any central global leader. I kind of get the impression that each colony is self-governing, and it's probably governed somewhat democratically or by a group of persons rather than by one individual. And, they hive off and another colony begins, and that's autonomous. Well, nothing is autonomous in the Brethren. Everything is highly centrally controlled, and ultimately controlled by one man. So nothing is not controlled by a committee at the top. They don't vote. Bruce Hale says what goes. He might delegate some powers to someone. And that makes it very unstable, because if Bruce Hales is in a bad mood, he might throw out a bunch of directives, just because he's got an ingrowing toenail or something. Or, if he's in a good mood and he's had a few too many, which happens frequently, I understand, he might just sort of throw out some wild card idea. And so in the Brethren, the rules are changing all the time. And it makes it difficult to discuss them, because you say, oh, well, this was the rule in the Brethren. And someone else will say, oh, no, it's not. No, that's not the rule. Well, it was at this period. But all the time, the rules change and new rules come in and old rules get thrown out. It makes them very, very unpredictable.
Yeah.
Well, a church like sort of Church of England, that's run by a kind of a synod and they all vote, change happens very slowly because you've got to go through a democratic process. This is like a tiny little dictatorship. I mean, this is one guy calls all the shots.
And some people have said this is closer to Scientology. Would you think that's accurate, or is that going too far?
Well, yes, no, it is. I mean, it doesn't have the same religious basis as Scientology. The two things it has in common with Scientology is that Scientology is kind of confession based. As far as I understand, in Scientology, you go and see your, I don't know what they call them, but kind of the equivalent of a priest, and you tell them everything you've done wrong, and you go through some process that cleanses it out of you, which is a kind of a cartoon version of the Catholic confession thing, isn't it? Essentially. And then, of course, in Scientology, the person who's heard all your stuff, it's all written down, it's all kept on file. And of course, the Brethren do that, which of course the Catholics don't. But the Brethren, when you make your confession, it's all documented and filed and no doubt computerized these days. And then, of course, if you leave, they've got all the dirt on you because you've gone and told them all. And certainly in Scientology, where persons have left and started to criticize the movement, this stuff has been dug out of their files and used against the persons who've left. And, the same in the Brethren, that when you confess things to people, particularly things that are very shameful and embarrassing, that gives that person a hold over you. Mm-hmm. And, the Brethren won't hesitate to use that if you leave the church. The other thing they have in common with Scientology is Scientologists use, I think what they called it, a fair game policy, which fair game is like a sporting term, which means a certain class of vermin, like sort of rats and rabbits and things, which you can shoot all year round, while other things there's a closed season for. So if someone was designated fair game by the Scientologists, it means that anyone, it's sort of like a fatwa almost. It means that anyone in the Scientologists can use any means they like, illegal or otherwise, to drag that person down. And it's like that in the Brethren. If someone leaves, they are cut off and isolated, and they'll generally try and make life difficult for you. But you might still be allowed kind of once a year, speak to your parents, sort of meet them on the doorstep and check they're still well. But if you start speaking out against the church or giving away any of their secrets, then you're fair game, and they'll do anything they can to damage you or harm you or stop you from speaking out, which is very, very like the Scientology, how they operate.
Is that what happened? Like, because they're not looking for everybody who leaves. Is that why they were trying to find you specifically? And
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, in New Zealand, this all blew up in New Zealand a year or so ago because the Brethren had hired a company of private investigators, and someone in that company leaked, I believe, and it all got into national press. In New Zealand, the Brethren were following 20 different files, 20 different individuals who had left, which is probably about maybe 10% or something. I don't know. It's really hard to say, but I mean, you wouldn't have to do much to be on their radar. They're not just following the most vocal one or two people. They're following a lot of people. They're watching them. And then they use the surveillance on people inside the Brethren. I mean, a very interesting story from someone, I'm not going to name a country because I don't want to give too much away, but there was the Brethren have very racist ideas. You're not allowed to have mixed race marriage at all. There's a very small number of Brethren. I mean, in the Caribbean area, there's quite a lot of coloured Brethren, but they're not allowed to intermarry with the white Brethren. But anyway, there was a young brother and a young sister. They call each other brothers and sisters, who were different races, and they were friendly. And the Brethren suspected that they might be, romantically involved, and so another brother was asked to put a tracker on the young guy's car and track where he was going. I mean, he got these orders directly from Sydney, Australia, and he said he felt bad about it at the time, but when you get an order like that, you have to do it. And so he was actually tracking this young guy. And this is within the church. This isn't people outside the church, just in case he was making a mixed race romance might be happening. And subsequently, the brother who did the tracking left, and so the story leaked out. But I mean, if that's what they do to their own members inside, then how are they going to treat people who've left?
Yeah, I think at some point you or somebody else used the term cartel. And that's when you talk about somebody tracking their car. It's like, that sounds like, Breaking Bad or one of those movies.
Yes, it is a bit.
Cartel.
Yes, and I mean, they'll steal people's computers and phones, and they'll hack people's phones and computers. And it's happened to me several times. They're completely unscrupulous. They're just, like I said, it's like, because they regard themselves as kind of God's elite special people, because they regard themselves as part of Christ's kingdom and not part of the world, not part of society as such, they don't actually believe that the laws of society apply to them. They'll comply with the law of a country up to a point, so as not to cause offence. But when it's a matter of their religion, if necessary, then they don't think it actually applies to them because there's a higher law. It was quoted a lot in the Brethren. It was said many times, I heard it many times myself, that the Assembly, which is one of their names for themselves, is the highest court in the universe. In other words, what they say inside the Brethren is higher than the Supreme Court of Canada or the Court of Human Rights. And so this is how they justify doing blatantly illegal things. And it's also how they justify perjuring themselves, because one of the prominent New Zealand lawyer commented, he'd worked for the Brethren many times, and kind of towards the end of his career, he commented that you could never beat the Brethren in court because they had no conscience about perjuring themselves. In other words, they would have someone come up and give a completely false affidavit or witness statement. And Brethren generally, they generally outwardly appear to be very respectable people. And so you get, some sister who's very respectable. She's wearing a headscarf, no criminal record, very good references. She comes into court and makes a witness statement against someone. it is very, very likely to be believed. And I mean, again, that was something that you could see in the Netflix documentary about the FLDS. There was, I don't know if they call them sisters, but FLDS women, you know, with their long prairie dresses and their sort of more funny bonnets and everything, just sitting in front of the press crew saying, no, we've never ever seen any underage marriages in the FLDS, and sort of weeping and being very pious. And in fact, one of those women was a midwife who had sort of delivered a baby for a 15-year-old girl. And this is the sort of thing that happens in the Brethren. They can produce these really convincing witnesses who will lie very convincingly, which is why it's very dangerous to tangle with them legally, because how can you win when they can produce any number of witnesses out of a hat that will say whatever they're told to say?
Yeah. And so that sort of gets into the indoctrination part of it all, that it's amazing to me that they're, unlike the Mennonite groups where are all closed and living together, the Brethren are living all over the place and could be, you know, my next door neighbor, yet still really completely, because it's not like they're shut off from the news.
No.
You would talk to your next door neighbor but still are so, you know, so tightly believe this and are willing to give all their money to somebody. Can you speak a bit to how that kind of thing happens, and or how does it, the other thing that goes along with that is, does anybody ever, is everybody born into it, or are there other people that come and join afterwards?
Yeah, that's really the key thing. That's really the number one reason why they're so deeply indoctrinated, is that almost nobody joins the Brethren. I mean, the only people I knew that joined the Brethren, one was where a young brother had left the Brethren, he had got married, and then he came back into the Brethren and brought his wife back in. The other was someone I remember who I think was just a very lonely sort of character, who sometime in the 60s got hooked up with the Brethren. She's just an old spinster. And, you know, she got kind of love bombed, and she had no family, I don't think. So she kind of, you know, it actually worked quite well for her. But for more than 99% of Brethren are born into the Brethren. Many of them, I mean, I'm fourth generation, many would be fifth and sixth generation. So that's one of the key things, is that when people talk about cults, you kind of think, well, you know, they've got this fanatical preacher guy and they prey on like homeless people and recovering drug addicts and people with maybe mental health issues, and they suck them all into this thing. And then they love bomb them, they make them feel loved and wanted, and then they start taking advantage of them. And then at some point, the people realize they're being screwed over and they, you know, escape from the cult. Brethren isn't like that, because they don't have to start with people that have already got an education. They control your educational experience right from the day you're born. People use the term brainwashing, and brainwashing, I think, originated from the Korean War, when American soldiers, Allied soldiers, were captured by the Korean communists and put into re-education camps and taught communist principles intensively for months and months on end. And then when these people were released, they came back to the USA, and they still believed all these communist ideas in their head. And then over time, being in, you know, normal American society, it kind of all wore off, and they went back to being the people they'd always been. That's brainwashing. The Brethren don't have to, but brainwashing implies that you kind of wash out some previously existing worldview out of someone's head and replace it with something different, which is what most cults have to do. The Brethren don't have to do that because they're starting with babies. So so for someone leaving the Brethren, there's no previous existence or standard of normality to refer to. It's like, you know, for me, it was like being born at the age of 46. you're going into the world and, you're very naive, very unstreetwise, and kind of frightened because you're told all the time the world is such a wicked place and that worldly people, even if they have a nice exterior, they have this kind of evil heart. And so that's the number one reason that the brethren are so deeply indoctrinated, because they've never ever known anything different. And then, of course, there's a whole very, very powerful indoctrination process that takes place every day that keeps them topped up and maintained in those beliefs. And I think I sent you some pictures. Like, I just put together a little bit of a scrapbook to try and explain some of those daily processes that keep the brethren lined up. I don't know if you want to put up.
Yeah, sure. Here's the pictures. So I put them all together. So this is
perfect. Yeah. So I mean, this is a Brethren meeting hall. This is the one in Toronto that was featured in the recent Breaking Brethren documentary. There's no Christian symbolism. There are no crosses or anything. The meeting halls are just completely functional sort of auditoriums. And they're sort of heavily fenced off. The public doesn't go in there. It's very, if someone inquires, they might be allowed to attend a preaching just to kind of show willing. But what's actually said, if there's a non-brethren person present, will be very different from what's said if it's just brethren present. And I mean, I sat through several, when the Charity Commission issue came up in the UK and the brethren were desperately trying to prove that they were not a closed club, the brethren actually kind of invited a few people to attend gospel preachings. And we were told, we were all notified before the meeting that there was going to be a worldly person present and that there's going to be a change in what we were going to do. We were going to sing 3 hymns at the beginning. We were going to sing 3 hymns at the end. The preaching was all just going to be basic Bible, scripture, conventional Christian stuff. No mention of Bruce Hales or any of the kind of leaders of the recovery. So it was all kind of a fake that was put on to try and make out that this is just a normal Christian church. And then, as soon as the people are gone, it's back to business as usual. So the next picture, we can scroll down a bit. This is a rare picture. This is the inside of a Brethren meeting hall while a meeting is actually proceeding. Someone very naughtily took a photo through the door, and the kind of bars you see on it, it's because it's the wired glass in a door. And some of the sisters and brothers are kind of looking around to see what the interruption is. And right in the middle, you can see a guy with a white shirt standing up, and that's a stand microphone in front of him. And he's holding his Bible, and he's kind of holding forth. And you can see, it's not very easy to see, but the brothers all sit in the front few rows, and the sisters all sit behind them. And the sisters are not allowed to participate in the meeting except for selecting a hymn to be sung. So it's all brothers. Sisters are silent. The only thing they can do is at the end of the meeting, they'll say, 247 verse 3, and then you'll all sing that hymn. So meetings happen every day. You go to the meeting every day and 5 times on Sundays. And, the meetings are at least an hour. Well, no, some of them are shorter, but typically an hour on average. And so every single day, every evening, they're working very long hours. The kids come home from school, they've got homework to do, and then you've got to bundle everyone together. You've got to dress in your best clothes. You've got to put your headscarf on. You've got to drive however many miles and go to the meeting every single evening. So, and then, it's basically people talking about and reinforcing brethren doctrine. So there's a very, very intense level of activity and indoctrination compared to a traditional church where, normally you have a service on Sunday and you may have a prayer meeting in the week, but this is like 10 times as much as a normal church.
And what are the brethren how do the Brethren doctrines differ from just reading the Gospels?
Yeah, well, it was based on the gospel. I mean, if you go back to pre-1960, it was fairly conventional. I suppose you would call it evangelical Protestant. Not particularly different from Baptists or Methodists or Presbyterians. But what happened but it always had that kind of element of separation, it had that element of, we are special, more special than everyone else kind of thing. But in the 60s, one of the leaders, a guy called James Taylor Jr., radicalized the whole thing. And he very strongly emphasized that he was the prophet, that he was, the man of God, and he was the one who would take them to heaven, and God speaks through him. So, it basically, the conventional Christian church sort of centers around the thought of Jesus as a leader. Basically, he took that idea and inserted himself into the chain of command. He was the person that God was speaking through. And now, the doctrines are really very abstract. I mean, Jesus isn't a very real concept to your average current member. It's all focused on Bruce D. Hales, which again is very, very like the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, FLSDS, whatever they call themselves, where this guy Warren Jeffs kind of took over from his father and focused all the attention personally on himself as God's prophet. So yeah, they have a body of fairly conventional explanation of the Bible, but inserted on top of that is this whole layer of belief that they are actually God's special people and God's only special people. And the Bible and everything is for them, and it's about them, and it's about Bruce Hales and so on and so on. So they've just hijacked. I mean, these kind of very unscrupulous, self-promoting leaders have hijacked a very stuffy old religious Christian denomination and turned it into a classic kind of personality worshipping cult.
Mm-hmm. So we can look at some of these other photos. We've got.
Okay. So this is I put out a little appeal on the ex-Brethren Facebook page to get some photos to try and show what life in the Brethren is like, and because it's young people and legal reasons, the Brethren being litigious, the faces have been blanked out. But what you can see here on the wall on the left, these are books of ministry. And what happens is that the leaders, the Brethren leaders, when they take a Bible reading or they preach, it's all transcribed and it's all printed and it's all put into books, and you're expected to have the books on the wall. And these go back 200 years. And so you've now got about 25 feet of books. And every Brethren household is supposed to have a full set of these. So actually, just going back up again.
Okay.
Picture. So these are the books of ministry you can see on the shelves, and these are on the wall in every Brethren house. And the photos on the wall there are all photos of leading people in the Brethren, which is again a constant feature in Brethren's houses. Is this kind of, you have pictures of the great men, as they call them, everywhere. And the girls you can see have all got hair ornaments in, which is part of the religion that if you're not actually wearing a headscarf, you have to have a ribbon, or as they call it, a token in your hair. And the hair is all long and uncut, which is also part of the religion. They regulate women's hairstyles very closely. Okay, so the next picture. I mean, these are probably from the 1980s. Again, these are 5 of the great leaders prominently displayed on the wall. I don't know what the young guy is doing. These are, yeah, he's trying to hide from the camera. Yeah, he's wearing his white shirt, which is mandatory on Sundays. So the next picture is, okay, so now when sort of Bruce Hales came in, he upped the ante, and they sell at a high price now to every Brethren household it's like a canvas stretched over a frame. So it's this composite picture of all the great leaders of the Brethren. And this picture was actually, someone found it in an advertisement for a piano company. They'd obviously sold this piano to some Brethren and took a picture of it and used it in their brochure. And there you have the great leaders. So yeah, scroll down to the next one. So here's more of a close-up of the great leaders. So starting on the left, there's John Nelson Darby, who kind of was one of the co-founders of the movement in about 1830. He died around 1900, and the next guy with a beard took over, who was Frederick Raven. Those were both basically based in London, UK. When Frederick Raven died, not sure the date of that, the next leader was a guy from New York called James Taylor, who basically led for the best part of 60 years. And then the next guy to take over, the guy right in the middle, was a very unsavory character called James Taylor Jr., who was the one who he took another brother's wife to bed with him and was sort of flirting with polygamy and groping people in public, and he was an alcoholic. And he explained all this away in religious terms to the Brethren, so they accepted it. But I mean, a lot of Brethren did leave in his era because he was completely crackers. He was the guy who really radicalized the thing and turned it into the kind of really weird cult it is today. He died in 1970, and the next guy to take over was James Symington, who was a North Dakota pig farmer. He died in about 86, and the next guy is John Hales, who was from Sydney, Australia. And when John Hales died, the thing was taken over by his son, Bruce Hales, who is the guy on the right, who is the guy who actually controls everything. He controls Brad Mitchell, and I'm quite sure actually is, he's the one who directed Brad Mitchell to hunt me down. I mean, Brad Mitchell hasn't got any personal reason to do this. In fact, I'm quite sure Brad Mitchell doesn't want to do it. Brad Mitchell's just kind of the fall guy that they can abandon when things go pear-shaped. So this guy on the right is actually the guy who wants me dead. And yeah, so, my parents and my brother and all my numerous cousins and uncles and aunts and all my other extended relatives all have, without exception, this poster on their wall.
And how do they choose who gets to lead next? Like, what's the rule of succession?
It's very mysterious. It's not like the Pope with all the business with white smoke up the chimney. It's actually, I suspect, a rather vicious battle at the top and a power struggle. And typically around the time of succession, a whole bunch of fairly senior Brethren get ejected from the movement, basically because they're the ones who lost in the scrabble for the top. So it's very vicious, very nasty. James Taylor the First managed to get his son in, which is sort of relatively easy to do because the Brethren are just so used to listening to a Taylor. And John Hales managed to get his son in, and I've no doubt whatever that Bruce Hales will try to get his son into the position, unless someone, in the Brethren manages to drag him down off the pile of bricks he's standing on first.
Okay, and then you've got the bookshelves.
Now this is the bookshelf, so this is very interesting. So this is a Brethren house with the ministry shelves, and you're expected to own all these books. So on the top shelf at the left, there's a series of black books. That's the ministry collected works of J.N. Darby. As I said, it's the first one from 1820 onwards. Then the red ones to the right of that are F.E. Raven, who had a fairly short tenure. Then the blue ones for the next shelf and a half are James Taylor Sr. The green ones are James Taylor Jr., which end abruptly in 1970. Then there's a couple of gaps and other bits. Something's out of order here because the red ones on the next full shelf down, those are Bruce Hales himself, who had a red cover. The next ones down, the darker brown, are John Hales, and the ones at the bottom that are kind of tan color, that's James Simonton. And the little blue patch at the end is a few odds and ends by other brethren, prominent brethren who weren't actually universal leaders as such. But that's a lot of pages. I mean, those are small print, solidly packed books full of writings and transcripts of ministry, and you're expected to have all that.
And I noticed that there's no like pictures of Jesus or crosses
no, nothing like that. No, that's considered blasphemous. You must have lots of pictures of. You have to have lots of pictures of the great leaders, but no, you mustn't have a picture of Jesus. That's definitely out. Yeah.
That's interesting. Blasphemous because it's like, are you not
idolatry? I suppose. Yeah, they would regard it as idolatry, but really, it's more because they want your attention to be on Bruce Hales, not on Jesus. I mean, one of the bizarre things that James Taylor Jr. did was he suddenly decreed that brethren shouldn't have pets. Just out of the blue. Up to then, brethren all had cats and dogs like everyone else does. And so the brethren, they had them all put down. Apparently there were lineups outside the vet with brethren with all their cats and dogs come to have them killed because James Taylor said you can't have pets anymore. And my parents did. I mean, it was before my time, and my mother telling me about it. They had a cat called Drusilla, I think, a cat called Drusilla, and James Taylor said no pets, so they take it to the vet and have it put down. So this guy just, probably a cat scratched him. He has a hissy fit, and then, thousands and thousands of cats and dogs all over the globe, all within the space of 1 week, are killed. I mean, this is the kind of weird ego that these guys, and this is why I say they're so unpredictable, because they'll just, out of the blue, a new directive comes and everyone complies, just like that.
Wow, that's incredible. And I think there's more bookshelves here.
So this is another set of bookshelves. I built a set of bookshelves like this. I bought all the timber and built it from scratch. It cost me quite a lot of money, but it's probably cheaper than buying it from the Brethren's supply company. Never read all the books, but I had them on the shelf, which was the main thing. And there's another portrait of one of the leaders in the distance there. Mm-hmm. Now this is an old photo. This is probably from the 1980s. The very typical Brethren men, they tend to be overweight because lots of good food and lots of alcohol is very much part of the Brethren religion. And they all wear their short-sleeved white shirts, as you do if you're Brethren on a Sunday. And there you can see all the volumes of ministry in the background. I didn't put the flowers in. I think they're probably quite an improvement.
And then
yes, so now this is with all those books. And you're expected to study these. To help you do that, they publish a whole series of indexes of the work. So I've just sort of snipped these from a photocopy I had of some of these books. So this is the subject index to the Ministry of Bruce Hales, Book 1, A to G. So this is subjects from, Aaron, I think, is the first entry, to God's principles on G. So it's an alphabetic index by subject that gives everything that Bruce Hales has ever said on that particular subject. So, if you want to look up hairstyles, or you want to look up marriage, or you want to look up government, thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of entries. So you can look it up in here, and it gives you the volume and the page, and then you can go back to the volume and the page, and you can look up and see what Bruce Hales said. And this would be a book about, 15, 20 millimeters thick, and there's 5 of them to cover all the ministry of Bruce Hales between volume 1 and 130. And this is 2014, so there'll be twice as much now. And then you've got the same for all the other leaders. So you've actually got half a bookshelf just full of indexes of all the rest of the ministry. So, if you have a problem or a question or anything, you're supposed to go to the index, see what the great leaders have said and pray about it and read some more. And this is how you resolve it. And, this is all part of the process of very, very deeply and thoroughly indoctrinating 55,000 people to believe that a rather overweight and alcoholic businessman from Sydney, Australia is actually the manifestation of God on earth, and that you really ought to give him all your money. So then in the foreword of this index, it says, this interim subject index, it's interim because Bruce Hales is still alive, so there's obviously more indexes coming, has been compiled to provide greater access to this distinctive ministry. And then underneath that, I've pasted just one of the entries, just kind of picked more or less at random, which is under the heading D for deportment. And can't actually read it because it's too small on my screen. Can you read that out for us? Can you read it?
I can make it bigger too.
Yeah, okay, great. Yeah, zoom in on that. Perfect. So this is under deportment. Every detail would be critical if I want my path cleansed. Every detail would be critical not to give the enemy an advantage over me. Would come down to the way I dress, the way I do my hair, even my appearance. You say, that's a detail. Exactly, that's a detail, but a very important detail. So this was ministered in Bahia Blanca, which is in Argentina, and this is the second reading of a set of meetings in Friday, 10th of October, 2003. So that's a very typical kind of pronouncement. And so every detail of your life is regulated by this vast bookshelf of ministry, which kind of looms over you every day. And you're very conscious of the presence of all this wisdom and the eyes of all the great leaders watching you every day. I mean, you'll have a picture of them in your bedroom. They watch you in the shower, they watch you at work, everywhere these eyes are on you. And of course, I have to very carefully put in all the acknowledgements, because otherwise they'll come chasing me down for breach of copyright and everything, which they do pretty frequently.
So this kind of thing reminds me of like Leviticus, where they go through and say, what your hair should look like, what you should eat and everything.
Exactly. Yeah.
When you get to the Gospels, though, there's one part where Jesus is really clear, like just, love God and love each other. Like, don't worry.
The whole law is in this one line, yes. Well, exactly. They love Leviticus. A whole lot of Brethren administration is based on Leviticus. The whole process of what they call shutting up, which is isolating people, and then withdrawing from people, which is throwing them out of the church and cutting them off from their families, all of that is based on Leviticus. And they use this term priests. When they talk about priests in the Brethren, they use it in exactly the sense it's used in the book of Leviticus. They love Leviticus. And as you say, it's a complete Old Testament system. It's like the old Jewish laws from 3,000 years ago, completely ignores the fact that when Jesus came in, he basically blew all that stuff away and said, the law is to love one another, which they're not terrible. Well, they're good at loving each other, but they're not awfully good at loving anyone outside of their little magic circle.
Yeah, and to what extent is it loving when you're so controlling over?
Well, exactly. Yeah, and what extent is it loving when you throw your own children out of the house and won't speak to them just because they don't share the same religious view that you do anymore? I mean, the things that people have done to their own parents and their own children in the name of Plymouth Brethrenism are just mind-blowing. I mean, they almost kind of weaponize your family against you when you leave. They actually use them to torment you, to kind of make you feel even worse than you do anyway. It's exceptionally cruel system.
Yeah, sounds like it. And then you've got
okay, so this is another part of the indoctrination. So you've got this man of God, or Bruce Hales, whatever you want to call him, whatever title you want to give him. Every week he's taking several of these meetings, several of these church events where he reads some scriptures and then he talks about it and pumps out there, very repetitive indoctrination. And those ministry books we saw on the shelves, they'll be published one per month. But just in case you can't wait a whole month to hear what he's been saying, every week you get what's called a white book, which is a little paper pamphlet of about 20 pages. And you'll go to church, usually on a Wednesday night. At the end of church, someone will come around, they'll hand you the white book, and that contains all the profound words of wisdom from Bruce Hales that he's actually spoken that very week. It's very real time. And you're supposed to keep these in your pocket. They even produce you can also order, along with your full size one, a smaller one that will fit in your jacket pocket to take with you and read. Now, this photo was taken by someone who had left the Brethren, who spotted a current member across the aisle in an aircraft and cheekily took a photo. And of course, this guy is, a very typical Brethren member. He's got that very short haircut. He's got very neat hair. He's clean shaven. He's got no tattoos, no piercings. He's wearing a dress shirt. And of course, being a good boy, he's not watching the cartoons on the, maybe there isn't a TV on that one. He's reading his white book, and you can zoom in and there's a white book. And that's what you're supposed to do. And you're supposed to wake up very, very early in the morning and spend an hour or two reading ministry and reading your Bible, and then you go to work your backside off, get home just in time to grab a meal, drag all your kids off to the evening church meeting, get back home about 10 o'clock and read your Bible and pray and go to bed and get up at 5 o'clock the next morning and, rinse and repeat. It's incredibly stressful, high demand lifestyle, and most of them are kind of just basically burnt out. And the only way they survive is by kind of drinking a lot to numb the pain and just keep going. It's a really, really high stress lifestyle, very high incidence of alcoholism, very, very high incidence of depression and antidepressant medication in the Brethren.
And there's no like computers or phones.
Oh, well, no, yes and no. They held out against computers for many, many years till about 2000. And then they kind of realized they weren't going to be able to do business without computers. So they, of course, introduced their own line of computers and their own line of cell phones. So now they are major cell phone providers. They provide all the cell phones and all the computers for 55,000 people globally. But of course, the phones and computers they provide have got their own software on them, which tracks you and which allows them to access all your accounts, and they know where you are and what you're doing and what you're saying. So it gives them a perfect mechanism of surveillance and control.
Wow, that's incredible.
When I left the Brethren, I still had my Brethren computer, and I was naive and I didn't realize that all this, was happening. And sure enough, if you read the small print of the contract that you sign when you get your phone and computer, it says they're allowed to go on it and read all your stuff. And so anyway, I'd left the Brethren. I'd been out a few weeks, and I was in possession of some very incriminating information from a Brethren firm I'd worked for. I'd worked for this firm for 3 months. And one morning I open up my computer, and it's just like a blank screen. It's just like, the blue screen of death. And I take it to a computer repair guy, and he works on it. He says he's never seen anything like it, but he did manage to get it working again. But when I got back into it and opened up my emails, all my emails for the 3 months I'd worked for that Brethren company were deleted, just neatly chopped out. It's pretty obvious who had done it. I mean, it was almost like, they could have wiped the whole thing. It's almost as if they did it like that, as if to say, we've got this power over you. We know everything about you. We can just come in and do this. Yes, and then I had a computer stolen. I used to work in a library at one point when I was out of the Brethren, and I'd stepped away to talk to someone on my phone and walked back, and my computer was stolen. Can't prove it was the Brethren, but a few weeks later, all my social media and websites and everything else, and my phone was simultaneously hacked. Pretty obvious who it was. And yes, and I had proof because I got a notification. I got a notification from Facebook saying, someone has changed your password. If this wasn't you, don't worry about it. And it definitely wasn't me. someone had come in and changed the password. The Facebook message gave the IP address of the person who had changed it, and the IP address happened to be one that was unique to a Plymouth Brethren owned business. And there's on my YouTube channel, there's a YouTube video where I go through it all and show you the IP address and who the IP address connects to, and the fact that the owners of that business were mostly trustees of Brethren meeting rooms. But yeah, that's another story. But yeah, this is part of their surveillance. Electronic surveillance is a very, very big part of their surveillance effort, as well as the private investigators and everything else.
Do you have, I noticed there's nothing else on their bookshelves. Do you have restrictions around literature, or do people read like regular novels, or is that?
Yeah, again, that's a very variable. I mean, the rules changed multiple times in my lifetime, and it also came a lot down to how rebellious your parents were. There was a certain level of discretion. So we read quite a lot of novels. Like, our parents didn't like us doing it, but we were all very avid readers. There was no television or radio, so you have to do something on rainy days. And they were kind of like the, what do you call it? They were basically children's novels. No, absolutely no adult novels. It was like Nancy Drew, that kind of stuff. And Anne of Green Gables and the Laura Ingalls Wilder books and all that healthy stuff. And yeah, I mean, I was an absolute bookworm. I lived for it. But other Brethren households, you wouldn't see a book in it, apart from the ministry. Some were a lot more strict than others. But yeah, it's very much, certainly you wouldn't see adult novels in Brethren houses. Children's literature, yes.
Interesting. Okay, so what else do we have? Here's another.
So now, just kind of moving on from the white book, this is what the inside of a white book looks like. This is the first inside page, which is kind of an index of what's in it. And this is a very recent one. This is April this year. This is Bruce Hales flew to London, and he took what's called a fellowship meeting. He named it Recognition of Christ, It is the Lord. And these are the scriptures he read, listed at the top. And then there was a preaching following the Bible reading, there's a preaching. And then in the course of his reading, he's referring to ministry by previous leaders. He makes numerous sort of quotes and references from previous ministry. So in this particular book, they've kind of filled it out by inserting the quotes that he's made, or inserting sections from previous ministries to kind of fill out the book. So then you've got one from this leader, James Taylor, from 1924, a reading in Oslo, Norway, a reading in Valence in France by James Taylor in 1939, a reading with John Hales, Bruce Hales' father, in 1958, Hobart, Tasmania, John Hales in Kingston, Jamaica, John Hales in Kellyville, Australia. And it says at the bottom, there's no separate pocket white book. That was the little miniature white book that you can carry with you everywhere this time, because basically probably because they were trying to scramble this out in such a hurry that they didn't have time to make the little version, because this was a very significant event. And so here's an actual quote from that white book. So this is about page 16. This is in his Bible reading. And this is something that is concerning, because, I mean, nearly all of the stuff is very repetitive and it's very abstract. It doesn't make a lot of sense. Here he's complaining about people, in other words, people who've left the Brethren, sending him letters. And I know what the letter was that was referred to here. It was a very respectful letter telling him, please stop breaking up families. It's unscriptural. But he's saying, yeah, these people are deranged. Then he's referring, this is the serious bit, he's talking about, they think they're going to alter the course of the recovery by, saying this, weak strokes of a pen. They're probably thinking of that saying that said, the pen is mightier than the sword or something. Well, I'd rather come across and have a sword fight. I mean, that is a pretty explicit call to violence. He's saying, the pen is mightier than the sword, really says that it's much better to have dialogue than to have a war. It's much better to resolve things by discussing them than physical violence. So he's saying, no, I want to have a sword fight. And when you've got 55,000 fanatical followers, and then a proportion of those are, statistically, inevitably going to be not particularly smart, may have, sociopathic tendencies. This is a really good way to get someone badly hurt. How seriously did he mean it? I don't know, but it's a pretty dangerous thing to say when you've got that number of people who take everything you say as literally being the gospel truth.
Has anybody been like? Are there any kind of recording of people who have been hurt, like hurting one another, or is there violence within the church at all, or?
There was a case. Remarkably, so far, I haven't heard of any ex-brethren who've been assaulted. There was a case that was reported in Australia of an ex-brother who was with some journalists who were subjected to a very aggressive car chase right across Sydney, Australia, that it ended up with the brethren in the chasing car ending up in court. But this is kind of a new thing. I mean, John Hales, the sort of previous incumbent, was very cautious in how he spoke. He was not. He was relatively moderate. Bruce Hales was the one who started introducing a lot of violent rhetoric, a lot of references to fighting and boxing and punching people. And it seems to be escalating. And then we're finding these, that they're hiring bounty hunters and things like this. So, up till now, physical violence hasn't been part of the Brethren's repertoire, but, I'm concerned that, this is what's coming next.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there was a case a year ago, Bruce Hales' oldest son, who lives next door to him, a cat called Gareth Hales, assaulted an ex-Brethren member who was making a video outside Bruce Hales' house. The guy called Lance Christie, who had been kicked out of the Brethren very unfairly, and he was actually making a kind of an appeal video saying, here I am standing on the street outside Bruce Hales' house, and I'm appealing to him to reunite the families and help these people. And this young guy, he's in his 40s, he comes bursting out of the mansion next door, he lives next door to his father, and tried to wrestle the phone away from the guy who was doing the filming, and was twisting his wrist, had this guy bent over double, and Lance Christie was saying, no, Gareth, no, stop this, no violence, and trying to de-escalate the situation. But the interesting thing was that the guy's phone video was on the whole time, so he got a video of the whole thing from this kind of weird angle of him being sort of bent double with this guy's hand on his neck, trying to snatch his phone from him. And it was violent assault, but I don't think he was ever prosecuted for it. But yeah, if you look online, if you Google online Gareth Hales assault, you will come up with this video of this big guy basically beating up this small guy and trying to drag his phone off him.
And what else? There's another.
So as well as all the printed ministry, they also have electronic indoctrination. So this is a service you subscribe to, and every day it will give you this cheerful bit of extract from the ministry in your inbox just to brighten your day. And this, of course, is a classic piece of Brethren indoctrination, that there's no other place to go. Even if the Brethren won't have me, that's their matter, but there's no other place for me to go ever, at any time, for any reason. And this is, reading in Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia, and it gives you the volume 42 and page 281, so you can go and look it up, check it for yourself. So it's just this constant, I mean, constant dripping wears away a stone. I mean, you're a teacher, you know, repetition drives the message home. You know, it's just constant feeding and injection, you know, sometimes very dramatically and coercively, and sometimes just almost imperceptibly. These, you know, ludicrous beliefs are constantly reinforced.
And then another.
And so this one, this is another one. This someone sent me. This is someone who left the Brethren. This is how their house used to look while they're in the Brethren. I think they've replaced that with a TV now. The interesting feature of this picture is that on the second shelf down, there's a whole set of coloured books. There's sort of some red and green and blue and then grey ones. Those aren't ministry books, those are photo books. It's a complete set of photo albums of every member of the Brethren globally. All 55,000 of them are squashed into that 4 feet of space. They're all photographed by family, and so there's a picture of the family, you know, the parents and the children. They're all dressed up in their Sunday best, and underneath it gives you their names and how they're related to each other, you know, what the wife's maiden name was, what her parents were called, what locality they're in. It's all arranged geographically, the names of all the children and the ages of the children if they're over 18 or something. I forget how it works, or the ages of the children if they're under 18. And you know, this is all part of them making you feel as if you're in some incredibly special select group of humanity. It's also very profitable. It's a very, very expensive set of books, and of course you have to buy it, and all the money of course goes, you can guess where. They've now, and on the shelf underneath that, they're kind of, it's hard to see, but there's a kind of a shelf of dark purplish looking books. That's one shelf of Bruce Hale's ministry. Presumably they got other shelves elsewhere for the other 20 feet they would need.
So it's like,
sorry, go on.
It's like high school yearbooks. Like that's what it makes me think of, all the
Yeah, sort of, yeah. So you can look up, if you hear any news about any Brethren anywhere in the globe, you can go to the book and look up and see what they look like. The thing that's sad about these books is that where a member of the family has left the Brethren, they're not in the book. So it'll list the children, but that member will just not be there. I mean, I was contacted a few days ago by a lady who's in her 40s, who came from Maple Creek, which is a little town in west side of Saskatchewan, place I knew very well. I was in the Brethren in Regina in Canada for 10 years, frequently went to Maple Creek. I knew her parents, I knew her brothers, I knew her sisters. I actually stayed with her sister and brother-in-law. I never knew she existed. Never even knew she existed. Like, people who leave are just wiped out. And the other thing that happens, of course, is that if people leave the Brethren or are confined or put under discipline, as they say, then they will take the photo book and they'll put little white stickers over the faces of the people who've gone. So if you were in the Brethren when they took the photos and then you subsequently leave, you get a little white sticker put over your face so they don't have to look at the faces of wicked people who've left. Which, I mean, talk about cancel culture. I mean, it's really disgusting. I don't know how to express it, but I mean, when I was in there, this just seemed the normal right thing to do. And now I look at it and you just realize how deeply warped your mentality had become, that you would think that it was okay to do things like that.
Right. Just rewriting history and taking people.
Yeah, so now this is the other set of books that you have, and this is business seminar books, because the Brethren are highly, highly business oriented. So as well as the ministry books, which are religious books, you have all these business seminars, and they're arranged in exactly the way as they arrange their big Bible readings. They'll hold a business seminar. In this case, it was in Westfield, I think. Westfield Business Seminar. Westfield, that's in New York State, I think, near New York. And so, thousands of brethren from all over North America would have gone to this business seminar. They would have listened to people like Bruce Hales, and I mean all the really prominent people in the Brethren are also very, very wealthy businessmen. So the same people that take the Bible readings and tell you about Jesus will be in a different venue on a different stage telling you how to make more money and pay less tax. And these are all published, and you have a set of these too. And you know, when you finish reading your ministry, you can find out how to make more money for the church. And these say UBT on them, which stands for Universal Business Team, which is the finance wing of the church. And it's very interesting to note in the Klondike Papers that a lot of these emails from Brad Mitchell and others, you know, trying to find me, trying to hunt me down, actually came from UBT email addresses. So it directly connects it to the church. This wasn't Brad Mitchell personally hunting me down. This was the church hunting me down, which, you know, everyone's known for years that the church has done surveillance and they hire private investigators. But in the past, it's always been, it tracks back to a member of the Brethren who's organizing it. No one's ever managed to prove it's actually the church as an organization that's doing it. So the Klondike Papers, for the first time, directly connects the finance wing of the church to this whole effort to hunt me down and kidnap me.
And
this is interesting. The Brethren bring in vast amounts of money from the outside world into the church, and they don't want that money then to leak from its members back into the outside world. It's like a national economy. You have to balance your imports and your exports, or else you get poorer and poorer. So as a way to stop Brethren spending money outside the church, they now have all their own supermarkets, which are private members' supermarkets. You can't go in there, and you wouldn't want to, because the prices are probably eye-wateringly high. But this is the inside of one of their supermarkets. And if you scroll down a little bit, you can see this is their 13. They've got 39 supermarkets across North America at the moment, and they've got probably another 300 across the rest of the world. Far more than that. I think 70 some in the UK and 100 and some in New Zealand and Australia. And this guy, Arden Bond, you can see this little guy at the bottom. He's a Brethren member from Maple Creek, and he's like the North American administrator for Campus & Co., which is their supermarket wing. And of course, all the money goes to the benefit of the church. And finally, this is off their Campus & Co. website. This is saying how much the Brethren communities purchases globally in a year, and they get through 10 million toilet rolls, which is an interesting statistic. And yeah, so basically they have a closed economy whereby they bring in very, very large sums of money from the outside world. To an increasing extent, that's facilitated by very dodgy, corrupt dealing with politicians to get valuable government contracts. And then once the money's inside the Brethren system, it's a closed economy. So when you're a big Brethren business owner, you pay your Brethren employees their wages, they go and spend it in the Brethren supermarket, and it all just cycles round in a circle. And of course, every time it goes round, Bruce Hales, one assumes, and his friends are just skimming a hefty percentage off the top, and it all goes into their bank account. I'm just sort of waiting for the day when Bruce Hales and his cronies all disappear. They've bought themselves some private island somewhere and built some mansion or some super yacht, and they just vanish off the scene and live off their ill-gotten gains for the rest of their days. I don't know if that's going to happen, but they've got such an extraordinary amount of money that I don't know what they can possibly do with it.
Yes, for some people, it seems like some people just have no concept of enough. Like there will never be an ending to that. They
always think they could be happy if they could just make one more billion. And in fact, it's the addiction to making the money and the power that it gives you. And I'm on minimum wage. I work fairly long hours. I'm not lacking for anything. You know, I've got a comfortable bed, I've got a nice apartment, I eat good food, I live in a nice area. I wouldn't know what to do with $1 million. But it's addictive. It's like alcoholism. You just have to have more and more and more. And I can only assume that's what's driving it.
Yeah. So in the Breaking Brethren video, you talk a bit about the car accident. You had a car
Yes.
accident that
Yes.
was the turning point for you. So one of the questions I have for all of this is how people, like, why people don't stay, but then what made it so you were able, why are you different to be able to be, I'm actually going to leave? What makes it, what do you need to be able to leave? You need some kind of a big event or something that wakes you up to see this, or
Yeah, very good question. There's two kinds of people who leave. One is people who just are not successfully indoctrinated, and they usually leave in their teens. They leave as soon as they can get out. They just, for some reason, they're more cynical or more rational, and they're just not susceptible to the stuff, and they do their own research. They realize it's a load of bullshit, and as soon as they can, they're out of there. Nearly all the other leavers, I mean, it's very, when someone is kind of married, there's a lot of pressure to get married in the Brethren, to get married in your early 20s. And the reason for that is once someone is married, it's very, very difficult for them to leave, particularly once they've got children, because if they leave, they can't take the wife or the children with them. So if you did a kind of a graph of, you know, sort of leaving against age, there's a big spike in late teens as soon as they can legally leave home. And then after that, usually people leave because they've got into some kind of trouble in the church, either by rebelling against local leadership or crossing the path of one of the Hales or one of the Hales' friends. And basically the church has made their life so hellishly miserable that something snaps inside them and they see through it. I mean, human gullibility or credulity is like a rubber band. You can stretch it so far, and then at some point it very suddenly snaps and it's gone, and you know, reality descends on you. And yeah, I mean, my experience is not so much the car accident itself, but the cruel way I was treated after the accident were that snapping point where I, maybe not all at once, but started to see that these were not the people they said they were. They were not kind, compassionate. They didn't represent God. They didn't represent the Jesus presented in the gospel, who was compassionate and stuck up for people who were, you know, going through a bad patch in their life. Very much a society where they praise you when you're up and they kick you when you're down. So, yeah, people who've left, a few of them are, it's kind of like a constructive dismissal, because they don't like to actually kick people out of the church, because it can come back and bite them, because, you know, people will, you know, it's almost illegal to religious discrimination to chuck people out just because they've had some change of doctrine. So they do this sort of constructive dismissal thing where they restrict all your rights and they restrict your travel, and you have to go and see the priests for lectures on a frequent basis, and they'll come around and pick holes in everything you're doing, and they'll screw around with your job, and they'll screw with your employment, and they basically make life so miserable that you walk out. And then, of course, if you then complain about the way the brethren treat you, they'll say, well, he went out of his own accord. It was with his own free will.
Whoops, he froze again. But it sounds like standard abuse tactics that happen.
Yes, I mean, remember that they have their own schools. So the people who control the schools, they control your child's education, of all brethren that you are local with in the same place, that you see every night at church. And if your teenage child misbehaves or gets in trouble at school, the trustee of the school, who's one of the brethren, will be phoning you up or coming round to your house to talk to you about the way your child's behaving. If your teenage child has some romantic liaison, the brethren are extremely strict about no contact whatever before marriage. It will be the local priests who come around and see you. Your employer will be a prominent local brother, probably one of the leading local brothers. The people who employ your children will also be, if they're old enough to be employed, will be leading local brethren. If you want to move house, you have to consult with these people. A lot of your business decisions are in their hands. They can make your life hell if they want to, because they control every single aspect of your life, and they can make every aspect of your life difficult. And they'll turn your family against you, so they'll turn your children against you. I mean, when they were kind of in the process of trying to edge me out, my daughter was engaged. She wanted to get married, but she couldn't get married because she wasn't told in as many words, but it was made very plain to her that, you can't actually get married until your dad sorts himself out. And the children, they wanted to go and visit Canada because, we'd been sent home from Canada to the UK. They wanted to go back to Canada and visit their friends. So we booked all the tickets, and twice the priests stopped us from going after we'd paid for the ticket. So we lost two lots of plane tickets for 5 people to Canada, return tickets, because they cancelled it at the last minute by throwing up a whole load of objections or imposing conditions that are so unreasonable that it wasn't worth going. So yeah, they just make your life hell. And eventually you snap and you go.
And you went without your family, is that right?
Yes. Yeah.
And how do you manage? I said it's like a choice between freedom and family. How do you make that choice? And do you hope to, do you see anybody, or do you have hope to see them? Or
yeah, well, I mean, at the time, it's not a choice between freedom and family, because you don't regard the world outside. You don't feel as if you're walking out to freedom. You feel like you're walking into some uncharted wilderness, and you don't know if you're going to survive. You don't know if you're going to make your ends meet. When you've been out there for 3 years and you've learned how to operate in the world, then you start to feel the benefit of the freedom, and you say, well, I would never go back. It's much better out here. But at the time, it's a choice between one hell and another. And they make it so bad for you inside that psychologically, you can't cope with the pressure. And so you get out to save your mental health more than anything else. You don't see or anticipate the benefits of leaving, because it's only after you've actually been out for quite a while that you realize that life is, in reality, unless you screw up because of your, being naive, you can actually have a much better life outside. But that's not what makes you go. What makes you go is the hell inside. And also the impossibility mentally of living a lie every day, because once you've realized that the whole thing is fake and coercive and corrupt and the people at the top are actually criminals, to actually live every day with every relationship, with your wife, with your children, with your employer, with all the brethren that you see at church every day, just to act as if everything's fine when you know in your head that the whole thing's a fake. And remember, you have to participate, you have to stand up, you have to make remarks in the meeting. Everyone participate, all the men participate. To fake all that for the whole of the rest of your life, to live a lie for your remaining 40 years, just mentally, I don't think it's possible. Once you see through it, the whole thing becomes a torment to you. And yes, I do hope to see them again, because I think the church has gone, Bruce Hales, in his greed, has gone so far, particularly with these government contracts, that I think the church is going to lose its charitable status. And I think that's going to bring about some kind of a financial collapse, because basically the money is all, ring-fenced by Bruce Hales himself. And I think people inside the church are increasingly there's an increasing number of people inside the church who can see that. And I think there's going to be a schism. There's going to be a big split. There's always going to be a hardcore that will follow the big G's. But I really think that a lot of people are going to, particularly with all the scandals that are coming up, are going to see through the thing and probably split off and form a much more moderate version of the Brethren, which probably will not have these ludicrous restrictions on seeing relatives. So yeah, I do think at some point, and my children are very smart and they're pretty cynical. They're pretty, they are going to be some of the first people to see through the thing when things start going sideways.
Okay, is there anything? That's all the questions I have. Do you have anything else you want to say?
You did have a question. You had a question on the list, which you said you didn't know if I'd want to answer or not, about court cases in the UK.
Yes, yes.
And I would like to answer that. It is true that there was a libel case which was successfully prosecuted against me in the UK. That was a civil case, and that was that. In that instance I mentioned where all my social media and my phone and everything else was hacked, I was publishing a website at the time that was largely about one particular Brethren business that was doing, to my mind, a particularly unpleasant fraud, actually defrauding the National Health Service in England. And this website I put up was completely taken down. In the process of this hack, this whole website was taken down, and all the social media, nearly all my social media related to this same scandal, that was all taken down and wiped. So when I got back online, I posted and said, blah, 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 Mr. So-and-so, the boss of this company, has hacked me and deleted my social media, which was very unwise because although in terms of, who benefited from this, obviously very expensive hacking operation, and because of what was deleted, it was very obvious who was behind it. I couldn't actually prove it was that specific individual that had done the hacking. So if I'd just put in one weasel word, like it appears that, or apparently, or I think that, or it's 99% certain that, they wouldn't have had anything to get me on. But because I just baldly stated this guy had done it, they sued me for libel. I couldn't defend myself because I couldn't afford a lawyer. And they sued me in the High Court, the English High Court. And in the High Court, you have to have a barrister as well as a lawyer, where a barrister is some kind of higher grade of lawyer, to represent you. You can't even just go in with your local solicitor, which basically means unless you've got $30,000 or $40,000 to play with, you're left defending yourself. You just have to appear in person. There's a very, very high barrier to getting representation. So I actually wrote a defense and submitted it. I didn't go along in person. I think it was about 20 pages I wrote. They had a kind of a pre-trial hearing in which they somehow engineered on technical grounds that about 18 of those 20 pages were inadmissible, so they were blanked out. This is before the trial even happened. So then they had the trial, and surprise, surprise, yes, I was found guilty of defamation, and they awarded £50,000 damages against Mr. So-and-so purely because I'd accused him of hacking my website and so on, which I'm personally quite sure he did. And I can prove that it was Brethren Company that did some of the hacking in terms of the Facebook. So that was the defamation trial. They also simultaneously, at the same time as they filed all these papers on me for defamation on a civil trial, they also filed an equally large bundle of papers on me for a criminal case of contempt of court. The reason being that I'd signed a non-disclosure agreement with this company, saying I wouldn't disclose technical details about their processes, machinery, so on and so on. And it was a non-disclosure agreement that was reinforced with a court order. It's some obscure part of English law called a Tomlin order, whereby you can have an agreement kind of rubber stamped by a court, so that if you break the agreement, you actually in contempt of court. It's very technical. And so, yes, I had obviously broken the non-disclosure agreement by speaking out against these, what I consider to be life-threatening medical deficiencies in their machinery. So they slammed me for that as well. And they won the case, but I was given a suspended sentence because they found a very good psychologist to examine me and determined that I was on the autism spectrum, and so which was convenient. So they gave me a suspended sentence, which is kind of like a slap on the wrist and don't do it again. So yes, it's true that I lost 2 court cases in the UK, but none of that is relevant to Canada or outstanding in Canada. There are no arrest warrants for me. In the civil case, yes, technically I owe them some money, which I can't possibly pay anyway. I've probably got about $3,000 in my bank account. And in the criminal case, I got my suspended sentence, and that has lapsed. And so, I'm a free man. I'm not under any legal obligations from the UK or anywhere else. So that's the story behind those. I mean, I pointed out to Breaking Brethren that it wasn't really true to say that those cases were nothing to do with the church, because of course they were taken entirely against me by members of the church who were very closely connected to Bruce Hales. But it wasn't the church as an organization who took those cases against me, though I'm quite sure they organized it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, well, that clears that up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so David had, when he said that you didn't have any, he couldn't find any warrants out for you.
Yes.
And that's when he started to see that, oh, this isn't quite right. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And when I confirmed that with the police myself, I phoned them up and said, look, after David had spilled the beans, sort of made that phone call and warned me through my friend to get out, I phoned the police and said, look, I'm hearing there's arrest warrants out for me. Like, what is all this about? And I gave them showed them my passport, gave them my details. And they said, well, as far as we can see, Mr. Marsh, you don't even exist. So there's certainly not an arrest warrant out for you. I wasn't on their system at all. So, yeah. Which is a good place to, it was a good place to be.
Yeah. Well, this has been really fascinating about how the education works and the indoctrination and how this all fits together with other aspects. And yeah, so thanks so much for sharing all your time and all this information.
No, thank you very much for making it possible. No, I really, as I said to you, I really wanted to have a conversation like this where I'm not talking to a journalist or a podcast host, but just, we're ordinary taxpayers who do ordinary jobs, and this is how we feel about this. This is what's actually happening to ordinary people. And does the ordinary Canadian taxpayer think this sort of stuff should be happening in Canada? Do they think that people who are perpetrating this stuff should be brought to justice in some way? Should political parties be allowed to accept big donations from religious groups that are actually directly controlled from Australia? And, basically what the hell is going on here, and why isn't anyone doing anything about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in Canada in particular, we have really strong rights for religious groups, which I know there's a case years ago in Quebec where there's a cult and a woman was trying to get her kids out of this cult that couldn't because of religious laws, because they were allowed to do this, and you couldn't do anything because the religious were so strong. and we want to be allowed to have whatever religion you want.
Yes.
Even to the extreme when it's harming people. But at the same time, I think we're seeing the enmeshment with this church and state, which
Yes.
we used to be really good at, even under Stephen Harper, even though he's a religious man and he came from
Yes.
the religious right, he wouldn't talk about religion in Parliament. Like it just didn't. He was very careful of never crossing that line. And now you see that with other conservatives who are talking about God. And it's like, feels American to me. Like
Yes,
that's
yes, exactly.
a Canadian thing.
Yeah. I think that's the thing that frightens me, and I think it should frighten every Canadian, is that the way things are heading is just looks very like what's happening south of the border, which is, you know, ghastly and tragic, and when's it ever going to end, and what a mess they're in, and they're digging themselves deeper into a big hole, and we just sort of peer over the edge of the hole and shake our heads. But we need to be very careful we don't go down the same hole ourselves.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I wonder if people are going to wake up to that kind of thing and start to question it more and question some of the power that the several different churches have in our political arena.
Yes, absolutely.
I wouldn't be surprised if things shake up in the next 10 years in one direction or the other. I'm nervous about which way it'll go, but I think
exactly. It's kind of a critical point at this time, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks again, and it was really great that you spent your time with us. And then I'll try and